past June 17, 2008, Tsutomu Miyazaki was sentenced to death for murder of 4 young girls. He was known as to be the girl killer because of that, and at the same time, he was known to be Japan's human Dracula. Aside from those labels, he was known to be someone with this twisted adoration for corpses, or in other terms, if you're familiar with the term, it's somehow he is necrophilic or has this necrophilia. When you say necrophilic or necrophilia, it's under a certain mental disorder category which is called paralytic disorder. And when you say paralytic disorder, this is a disorder with an intense sexual arousal or sexual satisfaction to an unusual or atypical object, situation, fantasies, person, or individuals. So when you say atypical, unusual, something weird, meaning to say you get your arousal, your satisfaction to weird objects. So in the case of Tsutomu, it was what? It was corpses. And at the same time, he was known to be a cannibal, wherein he ate part of his victim's body, typically the fingers. Okay? So, it could raise a serious question right now. What happened? What could somehow lead to these heinous crimes in Japan that Tsutomu Miyazaki has done? So, let's talk about his past. He was born on August 21, 1962 in a rich family because his father owned a newspaper company. But he was born with a deformed arm. You can see in the image what do I mean by a deformed arm. So somehow related also to a vampire named Nosferatu. Typically, so he had trouble with that. So with a physical disability, eventually it led to some judgment, it led to some bullying, especially in school. Especially such features would not work with the girls, diba? So he learned to isolate himself. He learned to be alone. He learned that it's much better to have this social deprivation in public because of being judged, being bullied because of what he looks like. Eventually, on his time of this isolation part, on his being alone part ng buhay niya, he learned some certain hobbies. He grew fond of reading comics and watching movies, but the movie was slasher movies. When you say slasher movies, these are subgenre of horror films, where there is a killer who would murder a person or a group of persons. So he grew fond of that. And when he was arrested, they found out 5,760 plus films like this in his house. And at the same time, as he goes with the comics and with the film, eventually he got bored. He got less excited sa mga ganong bagay. Then he moved to Japanese pornography. But same with the comics, same with the slasher films. He also got bored with the Japanese Japanese pornography because of the censorship this pornography has. Here he stated that they black out the important parts. So as he got bored with the comics, with the slasher film, with the Japanese pornography, he moved to an anime pornography style, and at the same time to illegal films, some are still pornography, which the victims of these illegal films are children. So somehow this scenario, the situation contributed to the crime that he would commit in the future. Let's talk about his family. He was deemed to be the black sheep of the family. He has no good relationship with his father and with his mother and even with his two sisters. He doesn't even want to inherit the business that his father has. There was also a situation wherein he was caught looking at her sister during shower or when his sister was taking a bath. Eventually, they had an argument, and ang nangyari, imbis na magkaayos sila, he beat up his sister. At the same time, he also had an argument with his mother about his life, about his future. Then, eventually, imbis na magkaayos, he also beat up his mother. So, some scenarios like that. But there is one person that Tsutomu has grown fond of, and has this close relationship, good relationship with, and that is his grandfather. When his grandfather died on 1988, the same year where he did the crime also, it's something weird happened. He ate some ashes of her grandfather's cremated body. The reason why he ate the ashes of her grandfather was somehow he wants a part of his grandfather to remain at him. So something like that. So if you could see the link between the crime and whatever happens in the past, somehow are related. His first crime happened in August 22 on the same year where his grandfather died in 1988. It was a 4-year-old girl which he met in the park, and he was talking to her for like 30 minutes. Then somehow he dinala niya to isang remote area under the bridge, where somehow he strangled the girl until the girl was dead. Then eventually he had sex with the corpse. Then he took the girl's clothes off as a form of reward. Then he went home. That was the first case. Then he went home. Then suddenly there was a change of heart. Then he went back where he left the corpse. Then burned the corpse. I think he chopped some part of the body before burning the corpse. Then he sent some ashes of the body to the parents and some teeth to the parents on a postcard written, ito po yung nakasulat, Mary, cremated, bones, investigated, proof. This was what was written on the postcard sent to the parents of Mary, the first victim. Eventually, the same sequence happened to the second 7-year-old, then to a third case, which is a 4-year-old girl, and the last one was a 5-year-old girl. The last one is somehow more, in my opinion, somehow more brutal in a way, somehow more harsh. Kasi bakit? If you would do the procedure of Tsutomu, ang mangyari kasi is he would get the girl first, take him somewhere, some of the like the bridge or somehow at his home. Then what? Then kill her. After killing her, he would have a sexual intercourse with the corpse. Some of the term necrophilia was there. Then burn some part of the body and send some ashes and some parts of the body back to the parents with a letter, in a letter form or in a postcard form. But on the last case na ginawa niya is that he took the girl, killed the girl, and has a sexual intercourse with the corpse for 2 weeks. Ganon katagal eh. At the same time, what happened is that he chopped the girl's body, throw it to some places. Then, aside from that, he also drank blood dun sa bata. So, kaya siguro tinawag din siyang human Dracula because of that situation. Eventually, he was caught because of his 5th attempt to have a victim, wherein the victim's father caught him that he was trying to zoom in a camera lens to, as reported, somehow in the vagina of the girl or between the girl's legs. He was caught by the father, reported by the police, and he was caught. Eventually, at his home, the video was found, the slasher video was found. Some parts, especially the hands, nakita, okay, dun sa bahay niya. Then he was arrested Then he was tried to court. When in court naman, he was what? They invited two psychologists, psychiatrists, whatever. Anong nangyari? One psychiatrist labeled he has a personality disorder, because somehow he was still aware or conscious of what he was doing. The second psychiatrist said that he was somehow has this cognitive problems already, or he was already crazy, or in Japan's term, he was already feeble-minded. But if the judge would take he was crazy, he was already feeble-minded, somehow the result would be lenient. But the judge decided that the case was too severe, at the same time to the impact it has to the family already. That is why he was sentenced to death eventually. So what's now my point of telling you the story of Tsutomu Miyazaki? Tsutomu Miyazaki is case, or the case that I'm sharing to you today for my criminology class, is somehow what? Is somehow dramatic and at the same time disturbing. Seeing or hearing a crime of murder done by someone we could say has this serious what? Serious mental disorder. The issue here now is that in terms of the connection of mental disorder or psychological disorder, in terms of its connection to crime, let's have questions first to answer. Diba? First question is that are people with mental disorders or psychological disorders has this high risk or has more tendency in committing crime? So somehow we need to answer that question. The next thing is that what's the line? What's the line or the link, the bridge between mental disorder and crime? What is this line? Is the line connecting the two? Is the link or the bridge connecting the two are thin, napakaliit lang, napakanipis? Or is it thick? Meaning to say, there are research already developed, studies that it's already been developed to prove that there is really a strong link, between crime and mental disorder. So for today, we're going to discuss these things. What is a mental disorder? What is the link of this mental disorder to crimes? And what are these specific mental disorders that we could relate to specific crimes as of now? So what are mental disorders? According to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual on its 5th edition of the American Psychological Association, or what we call the DSM5, a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by a clinically disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional, or behavioral response that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological or biological or developmental process underlying the mental functioning of the person. And at the same time, a mental disorder is associated with a significant distress and disability in social, occupational, or other functioning. So if you're going to look, the terms are loaded, or the definition is much loaded. So let's have a clear definition of, or a simplified definition of of psychological disorder. When you say psychological disorder, it's a psychological dysfunction. Psychological dysfunction within the individual. So you have dysfunction within the individual that is associated with distress, that is associated also with danger, And that is what is culturally not accepted or not culturally typical. So in other terms, it's called deviant. So somehow it's still a loaded definition. It's still what? It's still a hard thing to grasp in some point if you're not psychologically oriented at this moment. Pero to sum up everything, when we say psychological disorder or disorder, we're talking about also the 4D. 4D. So 4D of the disorder. So you have dysfunction, you have distress, you have danger, and you have deviant. So I'll discuss this not to say as follows. Okay, I'll discuss this one by one for us to understand what is the real nature of what we call a mental disorder or what we call a psychological disorder. Let's start with deviant. Okay? When we say deviant, it is something that is, these are thoughts, behaviors, that is what? That is different from mostly of your cultural context. So, when you say deviant, in a simple term, this is what separate what is normal from what is abnormal on a cultural context, on a societal context. Diba? For example, somehow being abnormal is kind of good. Diba? It's kind of good. Being different, kumbaga, out of the normal, it's kind of good. For example, if you are a genius, if you are talented, if you are athletic, that's good in some cultural perspective. No problem with that. But another example, we could say that killing is culturally accepted if there is a situation that calls for it to be done. Diba? For example, killing could be accepted if there is a combat situation. Let's say there is a war. There is a terrorism in your society or in your place as of the moment. Or it could also be acceptable, let's say, if it is for self-defense purposes. For example, your life is already at stake, then you have to defend. Eventually, you have to kill the person just to save your life. I think that would be somehow acceptable on that situation, on that perspective. But killing becomes, or murder becomes something unusual, something abnormal in a cultural context if there is no situation requires for it. For example, if there is already peace and order, there's no need for you to kill, or there's no need for you to do murder. So if you do it, as of now, if there is peace and order, I think that certain behavior would be considered something as abnormal. But the thing is with cultural context, or behavior on a cultural context, if it is unusual, weird, or abnormal in a way, it varies. That's the problem. It's a relative thing. It varies from one culture to the next. And at the same time, cultural phases, could either have this destructive stigma on the individual. For example, in our crisis today of the COVID-19, di ba? Umubo ka lang, may stigma na kagad. Ang bilis eh. I was out a while ago on the market. Then may umubo lang. I was falling in line, or was in the line. Okay, going to the market, to the wet market. Then may umubo lang without a mask. Typically, you would see the faces eh. You would see the faces ng mga tao. Di ba? Kung bakit siya. I cannot blame them. Pero as of the moment kasi, yung pag-ubo kasi right now, because of the crisis or because of the situation, was stigmatized already. Something like that. Kasi it's a cultural, so it's something abnormal as of the moment. It's something deviant, if culture would say so. But if we're going to define disorder based on deviant alone, somehow we will have a problem. So we'd have to have the rest of the three as part of the definition. Let's talk about distress. When you say distress, or before we talk about distress, let's talk about first stress. When you say stress, this is your reaction to a certain environment or to a certain stressor. So when you say stressor, is the one who causes the stress. So when you say reaction, meaning to say this is how you perceive or how you interpret that environment or that certain stressor. So meaning to say, stress is not a feeling. Usually kasi people think that stress is a feeling. We call that stress ako eh. So parang ang lumalabas is stress is something that we feel inside. No. Let me break the notion about that. Stress is not a feeling. Stress is more of an appraisal. When you say appraisal, this is how you judge or how you interpret, how you view certain stressor or certain environment. This is how you react to them. Diba? That is what we mean by stress. Now, another thing that you have to break about stress is that stress is what? Is stress good, or stress can be considered as good? Can we consider stress as good ba? Good. Good lang ba? Or can we sometimes consider stress at the same time as excuse me, bad? Actually, the notion kasi usually pag sinabing stress ako, yan na naman si stress, I have this stress again, usually the quotation is bad. Diba? Pero let me break the notion. Stress can be both good and can be bad depending on you at the same time. Because again, stress is a matter of an appraisal. So it can be good, it can be bad. When it is a good stress, it's called eustress. When you say eustress, it's a positive form of stress. We forget to see kasi some stresses kasi has a positive outcome on us. Depending again on how would you appraise the stressor or how would you appraise the environment that causes you the stress. When you say eustress, these are a form of stress that gives you positive outcomes at the end of it. For example, there are forms of stress that can motivate you more. There are forms of stress that can what? That can increase your effectivity in your performance. Diba? It could give you more creativity. Something like that. I'll give you examples later, but that is eustress. It's a form of stress that gives you positive feelings, positive outcome after the stress. Diba? But when stress is bad, has already a bad effect on you, it's now called a distress. This is the thing that we're discussing, part of the 4D, the distress. When you say distress or psychological distress, it's entirely based on what? It's entirely based on your negative view of everything. Negative view or negative appraisal on your environment, on others, and even yourself. Or it's really dependent on your view of your appraisal. Kaya nga the thing is with this negative appraisal, it could lead to a negative feeling. Compared to a eustress, it could lead to a positive feeling. This stress can lead to a negative feeling. Such as what? Such as unpleasantness. Such as intense sadness, intense anxiety, intense fear, or intense discomfort. And the thing is with this stress causes us to have certain dysfunctions. So that's the third D. So when you have the distress, it could cause you the dysfunctions already. Meaning to say, when you have this negative emotion, negative feeling, it causes you not to function normally anymore. For example, let's have an example to differentiate for you to better understand distress and eustress. For example, try to reflect on my question. Sino rito ang stress? Kala mo naman may kausap ako, diba? Tama, you're watching the video, pero let's think. Sino rito ang stress? Okay? If you're stressed as of the moment, can you cope with it? Kinakaya mo pa? Kung kinakaya mo pa siya out of this moment, I think it would not bad to say that is a form of eustress. Kasi you're still coping with it. You can still hang with it, diba? You can still handle it. But let's say, who here right now is stressed, but cannot handle it anymore. You cannot cope with it as of the moment. It gives you these feelings of emptiness. It gives you these feelings of sadness, hopelessness, na hindi mo na kaya yung stress. So typically, if you answer yes, you're now experiencing this stress. And somehow this stress has this effect that you cannot function anymore normally. Another example, let's say you lost a loved one. That's the stressor. You lost a loved one, siguro a death of a loved one or a death of someone that you really care for. That's the stress. Now, it depends on the appraisal. The line connecting the two, or the line differentiating the two, is based on how you appraise it. It's based on how you interpret it. So let's say you lost someone, a death of someone, pero if you as you moved on from it, you accepted it, diba? At the same time, it gives you a motivation to change for yourself. Kasi nung nawala siya, parang I need to change, diba? I need to have a better perspective in life nung nawala siya. I accepted it, diba? I learned from the loss. Definitely, it produces a positive outcome, meaning to say the stressor gave you a eustress. But if the stressor or the loss of the someone gives you an inability to cope with it, you cannot accept it. Hindi siya matanggap. It runs for years na, hindi ka pa rin tapos. There was guilt feeling na sana ganito, sana ganyan, ginawa ko pa to para sa kanya, sana ganon. And there was also self-blaming. Akong may kasalanan eh. Akong nagkulang, kung bakit blah blah blah. There was a hard time to accept the loss. Eventually impelled you to move on, to be normal again. Right now, you're experiencing distress. Again, it's a matter of appraisal. But the thing is, I'm not talking about eustress. I'm talking about distress. To be somehow called a psychological disorder, there's a factor of distress. Aside from the label of the society that you are deviant, there is a factor of distress. Because distress leads to the dysfunction. Leads to the dysfunction. When you say dysfunction, it's now a form of impairment. When you say impairment, it's a stop to something that is purposeful, or a stop to a purposeful activity that is reflected in your social, occupational, or other important activities. Okay? Kaya nga, when you have this negative feeling, somehow, you have this. For example, if the sadness is so extreme, it's so intense, somehow it incapacitates us to act or to do things like we usually do on a normal basis. Kasi nga, diba, mabigat yung nararamdaman, hindi tayo makakilos. Kaya nga, this one leads to this one. For example, when you say dysfunction kasi, it's an impairment, meaning to say, somehow you stop doing what you normally do. You lost excitement, you lose pleasure, you lose passion on things that you normally do or in a normal functioning daily basis. For example, you stop doing things that you love. You lost excitement on things that you love because you lost this someone. Diba? Going back to the example ng someone, hindi mo na ginagawa. You lose this passion. For example, another example, usually kasi for depressed individuals, the feeling of depressed leads to a certain dysfunction. Nawawala talaga eh. Nawawala yung excitement, nawawala yung arousal sa mga dati niyang ginagawa. Dati you go to the gym, dati you go to you bike, you go to certain places, you have these hobbies that you're so energetic, that you're so passionate. For example, because of the certain scenario that causes the depressed mood, itong mga dati mong ginagawa that normally ginagawa mo, wala na. Another example is that because of the distress feelings, okay, you cannot function anymore normally in school, in work. There is more absent, there is more tardiness, there is more low performance. But usually or normally, that can be seen to you, pero hindi na siya nakikita. So that is dysfunction. So again, we already discussed three. So you have deviant, on a cultural context, what is abnormal, what is different from a cultural context. When you say distress, it's a negative feeling, an unpleasant feeling, an intense sadness, anxiety, fearfulness, based on a negative view of a certain stressor. Then we have dysfunction, it's an impairment of the normal functioning of the individual. And the last one, well, not all psychological disorders tend to have the last one. Pero usually kasi 1, 2, and 3 are present on a psychological disorder or on a mental illness. Pero last one kasi, it varies from one disorder to others. Not to say that other disorders has the same tendency for danger. When you say danger, it's a harm from oneself and to others. Typically kasi this is, when we're talking about the line that connects crime and mental disabilities or mental disorder, danger is within the line. Ito sama yung isa sa nagpo-connect sa kanila. Because when you say danger, it causes you harm. Not to just yourself, but it also causes harm to others. For example, kasi if there is already danger to others, it could lead to crime against a person. For example, murder, domestic violence. It also could lead to crime if there's already danger. It could also lead to crime against property. For example, theft and arson. Then it also can lead to a victimless crime. When you say victimless crime, not to say it causes harm to others, but it now causes danger or harm to yourself. For example, you have illegal use of drugs. You have this addiction for alcohol, addiction for gambling, addiction in sex. It could also lead to prostitution, something like that. Kaya nga, if there is already danger in a psychological disorder, usually kasi, despite of the rest of that 1, 2, 3D, if danger is already exhibited by a person in a psychological disorder, the rest would be still significant, pero hindi masyadong titingnan muna. Ang pinakatitingnan talaga muna is yung danger. Yung regardless of your approach in how you look at the disorder or how would you treat a certain disorder, ang uunahin dito yung distress. The danger part. Yan ang unahin dyan. For example, if it's already a danger to oneself, for example, magkukomit na siya ng suicide, yan ang unahin dyan. Yan ang unahin gamutin. Yan ang unahin intervene. Yan ang unahin gagamutin. Then the rest would just follow. So that is a psychological disorder. So again, when you say psychological disorder, it's a psychological dysfunction. Meaning to say an impairment in the normal functioning of the individual. That is associated with distress, danger, and that is something that is culturally not accepted or culturally atypical. Still connected with the DSM5 definition, yung una nating binigay na mahaba, pero that's as simply as form. So we're going to go back to our case ni Tsutomu Miyazaki. Definitely there is a dysfunction there. He's not normally functioning anymore, diba? As whatever acts he did. At the same time, there's a negative feelings already because he has this way with girls. So parang meron siyang negative feelings sa girls. Siguro the way he was bullied before, and it's already deviant already that he has this unusual adoration for corpses, for for young childrens, medyo kakaiba na siya, that somehow lead to the murder. Diba? Kaya the question is now, where do we get this mental disorders or psychological disorders? Saan ba siya nangyari? There are two major approach in a way to explain why we have, not to say major, marami namang approach to explain a mental disorder. Pero right now kasi, for discussion purposes, I'll just explain two. First is the medical model, and the second one is the psychological model. When you say medical model, the best way to explain why we have a certain psychological disorder, because we meet a certain diagnostic criteria for it. Meaning to say, a psychological disorder is what? Is categorized to a relevant classification. When you reach certain specific symptoms, diagnostic criteria for a specific disorder, we could say you already have this disorder. If you're exhibiting such symptoms, such behavioral changes, such dysfunction, such distress, di ba? Definitely you would be categorized to a certain disorder. That's the form of a medical model. It's a form of categorizing an individual based on a specific criteria or a specific classification. So, the thing is, the good thing about medical model is that it gives us a specific way to handle or treat them. For example, if you're diagnosed or if you're labeled as depression, usually we're gonna treat you based on the symptoms. So, may symptomatic, diba? If you're diagnosed as antisocial, we're gonna treat you based somehow on the symptoms. We know what to do because you already have the symptoms. That's a good thing with the medical model. Diba? Somehow you're being labeled pero in a good way. When we say biopsychological model, we're talking about here an explanation of a psychological dysfunction or psychological disorder on a broad sense. Yung pangmalawakan. Diba? Not just to categorize them, but to explain them how and why you have this certain disorder. You have possible 3 explanations of why you have psychological disorder based on biopsychological. First is the psychological influences. When you say psychological influences, these are the experiences, the stress, your personal perception, your personal dispositions. The next one is you have your socio-cultural influences, your environment, your role, your status, if you're familiar with that on our last lecture, and the environment that someone can cause you or influence you to have this disorder. And the last one is the biological influences. When you say biological influences, these are the genes, these are your brain structure, these are your chemicals in the body that somehow would contribute to what? To your disorder. So if you sum up everything, it causes a disorder. For example, let's go back to Miyazaki. Some of the socio-cultural factor can be seen there. For example, the family, the school, the environment there somehow contributed on the way he perceives his or herself, his self rather, and his environment, the psychological part. Because may ganitong environment, ito perception ko, di ba? And someone, let's say, siguro he has this already a disposition, a gene for aggression, for violence, na nakapag-trigger. If you also remember the last video, parang that could trigger a certain psychological disorder sa sarili niya. Di ba? You could say that the family itself is a factor, the school itself is a factor, the way he interprets is a factor, his inherited genes, his brain structure, his chemicals in the body are all factors to contribute to a certain psychological disorder. So that's the main point. So somehow, I hope you understand what is a mental disorder? What is a psychological disorder? The next thing we have to do is to answer what? The issues we were discussing before the video. The thick line. The line connecting mental disorder and linking mental disorder and crime. What's now the link? What's now the bridge? How thick or how thin is the bridge connecting mental disorder to crimes? Does mental disorder leads to a certain crime, or does a certain crime leads to a mental disorder? Something like that. There are already frameworks that was established before. So there are already research frameworks that already connected the link between mental disorder and crimes. You have basic three approaches that we're going to use by the next video as well, okay, to explain the connection between the two. The first is direct pathway. The second is indirect pathway approach. Sorry. And the last one is common cause approach. So when we say direct pathway, meaning to say a mental disorder or a symptom of a mental disorder directly leads or directly give you a path to a certain criminal behavior. So kung meron kang ganitong simptomas, there is a tendency, there is a risk for offending, for criminal behavior. When we say indirect pathway, if you have this mental disorder, you also have somehow the symptoms for a specific mental disorder. But it leads to other causes. It leads to other situations. And these situations, for example, let's say use of drugs, abuse of substance, social deprivation. When you say social deprivation, isolation, diba? This situation that was caused by the mental disorder could lead to crimes or offending. So if you get the diagram, okay. Next is common cause. When you say common cause, mental disorder kasi and crimes at the same time, what? Share a common risk factor. When you have these situations, when you have these causes, at the same time kasi, both would cause mental disorder and crimes at the same time. So somehow that's a brief definition. Let's talk about this one by one. So when you say direct pathway, again, when you say direct pathway, you have this mental disorder that directly leads to a specific criminal behavior. If you have the symptoms of a mental disorder, automatically it leads, so not say automatically, sorry, it leads to what? Probability of leading it to a criminal behavior or a offending. For example, there were research before in 2002 that schizophrenia or the schizophrenic syndrome, I'm going to have this on another lecture video, schizophrenia spectrum, that one common symptoms kasi of schizophrenia is having hallucinations. And one form of hallucination is what you call command hallucination. When you say command hallucination, it's a form of hallucination wherein someone, let's say God, Satan, or authorities that you might think of, a higher person, is commanding you to carry out certain acts. Research shows that it's a high risk, or it's just a tendency. It's not naman a automatic view na pag meron kang hallucination, automatically it leads to violence. No. Their point is it's just a high risk or a tendency lang, that somehow it could lead to a violent behavior or violence or violent crime, parang ganon. Then it goes to show, based on the research also, that it's not dangerous talaga if you have this command hallucination. But the thing is kasi, some people with command hallucination tends to act the command that leads to certain violence. Pero we're not generalizing. Everyone has a command hallucination, and everyone with command hallucination will automatically carry out a certain act, di ba? Pero doon kasi sa mga may command hallucination, who carry out the command, and at the same time the command would put harm to others, would put harm to self, and carried it out, there's now a high risk, or there's now a tendency for an offending crime. So, kung babalikan yung diagram ng direct crime, parang ganon, di ba? For example, balik tayo sa ating case kanina, si Tsutomu. In terms of Tsutomu, if Tsutomu talaga is really a pedophile or a necrophilia, pero based on the case naman, mukha naman, di ba? Because of the symptoms of a necrophilia and the symptoms of a pedophile, it resulted to the certain crime, diba? He has this adoration for corpses. Eventually, the reason why he chose to victimize little young girls, diba? Or young girls at the age of 4, 7, 5, diba? Would really show, because he has the symptoms of a pedophile, of this necrophilia. It leads to certain murders. It leads to certain acts, heinous acts like that. So that is what we mean by direct behavior. When we say indirect pathways, When we say indirect pathways, meaning to say you have a psychological disorder, or you have the symptoms, but it leads to other situations first before it leads to a offending. For example, someone with mental disorder are more high risk in abusing drugs or abuse of substance, because usually they do this for self-medicate, that somehow it would lessen the symptoms that they are feeling, or it would eliminate the symptoms they are having, diba? For example, if you are depressed, then you want this depressed mood to lessen or to eliminate. There would be tendency that you would use antidepressant drugs. But the thing is kasi, if you already have this good feeling na nawawala talaga siya, there is a high risk again, there's only a tendency again na baka ma-addict ka, or you would abuse the substance, because somehow it lessens, or somehow the elimination na nawawala talaga yung depressed feelings nandun eh. Kaya there's a tendency talaga you would use that. Kaya nga, if you now start to use the drugs, definitely it could lead to crimes. It could lead to a certain criminal behavior na. For example, the use of cocaine. Diba? The use of cocaine for what? A psychoactive drug. The use of cocaine could lead to hallucination. It could lead to a delusion. Let's say the delusion again. Diba? Now, this mental disorder, nawawala yung sintomas, pag gumagamit ka ng cocaine, diba? Now, the cocaine leads you to have hallucination, it leads you to have delusion. Let's say one of the hallucination is a command hallucination na naman ulit, then definitely it would lead to another specific criminal behavior. So something, kaya nga siya indirect, hindi siya directang mental disorder tapos krimen. Now, mental disorder, it could lead to somehow another situation, and that situation would lead to offending first. Diba? For example, another example for indirect pathway is that, let's say, you have this mental disorder, I will not specify it pa, then it leads to a social deprivation. When you say social deprivation, isolation, and this isolation could, same with Miyazaki, diba? With this isolation, he learned what? He learned to have this aggressive tendency somehow by watching slasher films. He learned to have this pedophilic feeling to children by having this sexual arousal on watching children as victims in a pornography. So something like that. Then eventually, it leads to a certain criminal behavior. When we say naman, common cause approach, meaning to say both mental disorder or crime have same risk factor. If you would remember general strain theory on our first blog lecture for this subject, social deprivation, social stress, diba? Living conditions are same risk factors that would contribute with mental disorder and mental and crimes. If you have this stresses, for example, if you have this familial factor, cultural factor, or other forms of stress, both of them can contribute big in terms of developing at the same time crime and at the same time mental disorder. So in terms of Miyazaki again, we could say that the crimes that he did and the mental disorder that was possibly he has was due also by what? The stressors he experienced, the family environment, the cultural environment he has, di ba? His living condition at the same time contributed kung bakit meron siya ganon at bakit niya yun nagawa. So, eventually, these frameworks naman will be proven when we are now discussing specific mental disorders. For the next video, I'll be discussing specific mental disorders or psychological disorders, specifically schizophrenia, personality disorder, conduct disorder, mood disorders, bipolar and depression. Then you have substance abuse disorder, and you have paralytic disorder, or what we know as somehow sexual disorders. So again, that is our topic for this entire blog lecture. So what is a mental disorder? What is the connection between these mental disorders and crimes? Okay, what are these different frameworks that connects these two? We have the direct path, we have the indirect pathways, and we have the common cause approach. So the next blog video would really prove how this three framework works in terms of connecting mental disorders and crime. So that's it. Thank you guys for watching. Bye.